The Sierra Nevada, California. Part 2. Going nowhere. Akira looked up in a daze. Something had hit her side of the car. Another car, she remembered groggily. And then something had punched her in the head. An airbag. Airbags had burst from the dashboard and the doors, knocking everybody around as much as the crash. Akira and Sue had been pushed into the middle of the seat, and they helped each other up as Akira blinked away the fog in her brain. "Dad?" Akira said, her tongue thick in her mouth. "Are you okay?" In the front seat, her dad stirred. So did Daniel. Everybody seemed to be all right. Akira's dad clawed at the airbags that surrounded him, trying to see. "Can we move?" he asked. Daniel punched at the gas pedal, but the engine had stopped. He tried the ignition. "It won't start," he said. Akira pushed her airbag out of the way. The car that had hit them was right outside her window. Its airbags had gone off too, and she couldn't see inside. Just seconds ago, they'd escaped the fire, but now Akira saw flames spreading through the forest around them. The fire leapt from tree to tree, almost like a squirrel. It was mesmerizing to watch. Hot cinders bounced onto the car that had run into them and settled in, smoldering on its surface. Akira suddenly remembered the other car they'd seen, the one burning in the ditch. How long until the car that hit them caught on fire? How long until their car caught on fire? "Dad!" Akira cried. "We have to get out!" Trapped. "We can't leave the car," said Daniel. "We'll die out there." "The car in the ditch caught fire," Akira told them. "Ours will too." Sue sobbed next to her. It was blazing hot and hard to breathe. "Akira's right. We have to get out," Akira's dad said. "Let's go." He threw open his door, and brown smoke poured inside. Akira squeezed her eyes shut and choked. Daniel got out on his side, letting in more smoke. "Sue, let's go," he called. Akira unbuckled her seatbelt and tried to open her door, but it wouldn't budge. "What? No!" She yanked on the handle again and looked out the window. The car that had hit them was blocking her door. Akira's dad opened Sue's door and leaned inside. "Akira, get out!" he cried. "I can't. It's blocked," Akira told her dad. "Sue, we have to go out on your side," she said. Sue stayed where she was, clutching her shoulder and crying. She shook her head. "I can't," she sobbed. Akira huffed. Whatever was wrong with Sue, there was no time to talk her down. Akira unbuckled Sue's seatbelt, and the two dads pulled Sue out through the door. Akira crawled out right behind her and winced. Leaving the car was like walking into an oven. Hot air blasted Akira in the face, and she choked on a lungful of heavy smoke. The woods all around them were alight with scorching, blinding flames. Akira's father pulled her close, and she felt her desperation and fear echoed in his embrace. "The other car!" Daniel cried. "Nobody's gotten out of it yet!" "Stay here on the pavement," Akira's dad told her and Sue, and the two girls watched as their dads hurried to help whoever was inside. Sue wobbled, and Akira helped her stand. Sue's left arm hung limp, and she grimaced and clutched at it with her other hand. She was clearly more hurt than Akira had thought. Choom! A flaming tree on the other side of the street exploded from the inside out. startling Akira and Sue and making them cry out. The tree began to tilt and then fall, and crick, crack, shroom! It crashed into the road, separating the girls from their dads. The Human Pinball. "Dad!" Akira screamed. "Dad!" cried Sue. Akira tried to lead Sue around the burning tree, but she couldn't find a safe path through the flames. Glowing orange cinders swirled in the wind. "Akira! Sue!" they heard their dads cry, and Akira squinted to see through the branches of the burning tree. Their dads were together, their arms around an old couple helping them stand. The people from the other car. "Dad!" Akira cried. "I can't get back to you!" Another tree fell behind them, and Akira and Sue ducked and scrambled away from it. "Akira, run! Get somewhere safe!" her dad yelled. "No!" Akira cried. She couldn't leave her dad. Where would she go? How would she and Sue survive the fire? "Just get out of the fire, then head for home," Akira's dad yelled. "You know the way." "I can't!" Sue screamed. "Dad!" "You can do this!" Sue's dad called back. His voice strangled with anguish and smoke. "Stay together! Everything's going to be all right, Sue. I love you." "No! Dad!" Akira cried again. "I love you, Akira," her dad called. Another tree whoomphed down behind them, and another, and there was no more time for debate. Akira grabbed Sue's hand and pulled her away. "Get somewhere safe," Akira's dad had said. But what was safe in the middle of a wildfire? Not even the pavement was free from the fire anymore. Burning branches and tree limbs filled the road, and Akira and Sue tripped and stumbled as they ran. Akira could barely breathe, let alone see. Akira squeezed her eyes almost all the way shut and put her free hand out to feel where she was going. She felt heat to her right and went left. She heard crackling and popping to her left and went right. Behind her, Sue cried out in pain. Akira looked back and saw the arms Sue had been clutching, dangling unnaturally by her side. She was hunched over, like she was sick to her stomach. Something was definitely wrong with Sue, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. Akira plodded forward, trying to get them someplace where there was no smoke, no fire. But the smoke and fire were everywhere. Akira ran into a burning pine tree and bounced away, crying out in pain from the sting of the flames. She bumped into another tree and pinballed through the heavy smoke and heat, Sue staggering along behind her. The forest floor crackled and smoldered under their feet, and Akira stopped. "Oh no," she realized. "We've left the road, and we're in the forest." She spun, trying to find her way back to the safety road, but it was gone. Lost in the smoke. Akira picked a direction and pulled Sue with her. They kept dodging flames until at last they stumbled into a small clearing in the woods full of smoke, but no fire. "Dad?" Akira called, bending double and trying to catch her breath. "Are you there? Can you hear me?" "Dad?" Sue tried. They heard the crackle and pop of somebody walking toward them through the dry pine needles on the forest floor, and the girls looked up hopefully. But it wasn't their dads. It was Morris. The crackling and popping was the sound of the fire slowly advancing on them through the woods as it ate up tree after tree after tree. It was like the wildfire was playing some horrible game of hide-and-seek with them. "Come on," Akira said wearily, taking Sue's hand. "We're not beat yet." Bad signals. Akira and Sue found another small clearing where the smoke wasn't as thick and there wasn't any fire. Not yet, at least. Sue collapsed onto the ground, and Akira slumped down beside her, glad for a moment's rest. They were both gasping for breath and covered in sweat and scratches and burns. Sue closed her eyes and clutched her injured arm while Akira tried to get her bearings. They had left the road and run uphill into the forest. But where were they now? How far had they run? "Dad?" Akira called again, her throat ragged. No one answered. "Dad!" Sue yelled, hacking and coughing. Still no answer. "We're going to die," Sue moaned. "The fire's going to eat us up, and we're going to die." Akira shook her head. She refused to believe that. "We're not going to die," she wheezed. "Do you have a phone?" Sue shook her head and wiped away a tear. "I dropped it in the wreck." Akira still had hers. She pulled it out and tried to call her dad, but he didn't answer, or couldn't. Panic seized Akira's throat, making it even harder to breathe. The wind was hot and strong, and gusting in their faces. How long until Morris blew hot embers into the clearing and chased them away again? Akira tried her mom's cell phone, and she listened to it ring and ring and ring with growing despair. "Akira!" her mother cried, answering at last. "Oh, thank goodness you're alive! Where are you? What happened?" Akira sagged with relief. She quickly told her mom about meeting Sue and Daniel, about the harrowing drive through the fire, and her and Sue getting separated from their dads. "Don't worry about your father. He knows these mountains like the back of his hand," her mother said. Akira could hear the panic in her voice, though. The doubt. "You have to focus on you now," her mother said. "You have to..." "Have to what?" Akira said, sniffling. "Mom, you're breaking up." "Akira, I'm looking online," her mother said, her voice going in and out. "There's one big fire, but fires all over the mountains around you, too. Maybe started or sparking electric lines. The smaller fires are... and the bigger fires are joining up to make one massive mega fire. In every direction. But you can make it home if you..." "If I what?" Akira said. "Mom? Mom, are you there?" Akira pulled the phone away from her ear and looked at the screen. The call had disconnected. Tag, you're it. Akira tried her mom again, but an automated voice told her the call could not be completed as dialed. She was getting no signal bars at all now. Akira lowered her head. She and Sue were truly alone. "What did she say?" Sue asked. "She was cutting in and out," said Akira. "But it sounds like there's fires all around us, combining into one big mega fire." Sue's eyes went wide, and she got a far-off look, like she was about to go catatonic. "We can stay out of the fire's way," Akira said, trying to calm her down. "I can get us back to my house." Akira noticed again how Sue was holding her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" she asked. Sue nodded. I can't move my arm. Akira slid over and took a look. Sue hissed as Akira pulled the sleeve of her t-shirt back. There was no cut and no blood, but something about her left shoulder didn't look right. It was lower than her other shoulder and not as round. My dad and I were going camping once when his horse threw him and he dislocated his shoulder, Akira said. I think that's what this is. It was probably your seatbelt that did it. Akira remembered how much pain her father had been in when he fell. If it hurt as bad as all that, Sue was one tough cookie. You need ice on it, and a sling. My dad showed me how to make one from an extra shirt. One more thing her dad had taught her, Akira thought. For now, just take your shirt off and put it back on with your injured arm inside instead of through the sleeve, she told Sue. That'll keep your arm from moving around. Akira helped Sue stand up and rearrange her shirt. How can you be so calm about all this? Sue asked. Akira wasn't calm. This was supposed to be her day away from everything. The day she recharged her batteries. She hadn't gotten to do that, and now she had a wildfire to deal with, and somebody she had to take care of and talk to. She was freaking out inside. She just didn't feel the need to show every emotion all the time, especially with someone she didn't know very well. Akira sighed. If she was going to be lost in a wildfire, Akira wished it was just her and Dodger, and nobody else. There, she said when they had Sue's shirt fixed. They can put your arm back in its socket at the hospital in Cooperstown. That's the same direction as my house. If we don't find somebody to help us before that, my mom can drive you. You think you can make it? Sue still frowned with pain, but she sniffed and stood up a little straighter. Yeah, she said. I've been through worse. Akira couldn't hide her surprise at that. Is she talking about when she got those scars? Akira couldn't not see them now. 3 half-inch parallel lines on Sue's forehead. But Sue didn't say anything more, and Akira didn't ask. Sue would tell her when and if she wanted to. A red-hot ember floated down to the dry brown pine needles at their feet, and Akira watched as the pine needles caught fire with a whoomp. Tag, thought Akira. You're it. It was time to move. Akira steered Sue away from the fire, and they fell into the slow, clumsy rhythm of a 3-legged race. Sue grunted. Do you know where we are? Not exactly, Akira admitted. I'm taking us back up to the top of the mountain. Then we can look for a clear path to my house down the other side. It was an old trick her father had taught her. When you're lost, get higher to get some perspective. As they walked, Akira looked back at the orange flames that filled the valley behind them. Morris was gaining on them. They needed to be moving faster. Could have been moving faster if not for Sue. The other girl kept clutching her midsection with her good arm, and Akira wondered if Sue didn't have a couple of fractured ribs to go with her dislocated shoulder. There was no way to know until they got her to a hospital, but Sue was moving at the loping pace of a bear. A rumble echoed down the mountainside and Akira froze. A tiny rock hit her, and she flinched. Then another rock hit her. And another. She knew what this was. Rock slide! Akira cried. The new normal. Akira dragged Sue behind the closest pine tree. She'd seen rock slides up in these mountains before. But here? Now? With Morris nipping at their heels? It was like nature itself was trying to kill them. Akira hugged Sue close, waiting for the earth to come sliding past, but it fell on their heads instead. Tiny rocks like rain. Thunder boomed, making them both jump, and Akira suddenly understood. This wasn't a rock slide. It was a hailstorm. Akira and Sue ducked, trying to protect themselves. The tree's branches helped a little, but the hail still hurt. That explains the wildfire, I guess, Akira said. The hail does? Asked Sue. Lightning strikes from the storm, said Akira. But it wasn't raining before, said Sue. Dry thunderstorm, said Akira. We get the lightning, but not the rain. Sue nodded. When we moved to Fresno, the city told us we were only allowed to water our lawn on Saturdays, and never during the day, she said while the hail beat down on them. We got this postcard telling us not to leave the water on when we brush our teeth, and to fill our bathtubs only half full or take 5-minute showers. That's not normal, is it? Akira thought about that. California had been in a drought for 10 of the 13 years she'd been alive. Her father said it was just part of nature's cycle. But if they had drought conditions more often than not now, didn't that make droughts the new normal? Sue looked at her sideways, and Akira realized she'd never answered her out loud. She grimaced. She had a bad habit of not talking enough, which was part of the reason she didn't have any close friends besides Dodger. Does dry lightning cause all the wildfires? Sue asked. No, Akira said, remembering to speak this time. Mostly it's people. Sometimes it's sparks from our electric lines that start wildfires. Sometimes it's people burning trash. She paused. One time, it was a woman boiling bear pee to drink it. Sue gave Akira a dubious look. It's true, Akira told her. Sue cracked up, and Akira laughed with her. It felt wrong to laugh when they were in so much danger, but they both needed the release. The hail stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and Sue and Akira stepped out from under the tree. It had grown darker and smokier while they'd waited out the storm. Well, while we're standing around talking about it, Morris is just getting closer, Sue said. Come on, let's get the hell out of here. Akira snickered in spite of herself. If we don't, there'll be hell to pay, she said, trying to be funny again. Sue guffawed, and Akira smiled. Maybe having Sue with her wasn't the worst thing in the world after all. A day off. Akira and Sue limped through a patch of California lilac and white firs, the fire hissing and growling somewhere behind them. The sounds made Akira imagine all kinds of horrible things. Dodger and Elwood running through the burning forest. Her dad, surrounded by fire. Were he and Sue's dad all right? And what about the old couple from the car? Were they all picking their way through the smoky forest like Akira and Sue? Or had Morris caught them up in his fiery jaws and... Akira shook her head. She couldn't think like that. Akira looked at Sue. The normally chatty girl had gone quiet. Usually Akira would have been fine with that. People talked too much as it was. But Akira worried that Sue being quiet meant she wasn't doing well. What would Akira's father do right now? Make small talk, of course. But how? What did people talk about when there wasn't anything they had to talk about? So, why did your family move to Fresno? Akira asked at last. Huh? Oh, I'm a competitive swimmer, Sue said. Sue's voice was tight with pain, but Akira was secretly pleased at her own success in making small talk. Part of the reason we moved here was because our little town only had one pool, Sue went on. And it wasn't even Olympic-sized. You're going to the Olympics? Akira asked, impressed. No, said Sue. I mean, I'd like to, but that probably won't happen. I might be good enough to make a college swim team, though. Get a scholarship. That would be awesome. It's a lot of work, though. I have swim practice twice a day, almost every day. Today was my day off, she said sadly. Mine too, said Akira, and she felt another pang of loss for her peaceful Saturday morning ride among the monarchs. I do love swimming, though. I could be in a pool all day, every day, Sue said. The town I came from was really small, like just 16 kids in my whole grade level. It was kind of hard to get away from everybody, unless you went off by yourself in the country. That's not really for me. So I learned to disappear in the pool. When I'm in the water, it's like the rest of the world just falls away, you know? Like it's just me and my thoughts. Yes, said Akira. That's exactly what I love about riding Dodger. That's where I want to be every day, all day. On my horse, riding the trails. Nothing else really matters. Sue nodded. She gets it. She really gets it, Akira thought, and she smiled. The last person Akira had felt this close to was Patience, the college student her parents had hired as a babysitter when Hildy was born. Akira had been 9 then, and didn't really need a babysitter, so Patience had become more like an older sister to her. Patience had given her space, but when Akira wanted to talk, she'd really listened, and understood what Akira was trying to say. And boy, talk about somebody who wasn't afraid to argue with her dad when he went off about climate change. Akira hadn't thought she'd ever find a friend like that again. But maybe Sue was somebody who could be a real friend when all of this was over. Sue stumbled on a rock and cried out in pain, and Akira caught her before she could fall. They stood together for a moment, Akira hanging onto the injured girl while Sue bent over and tried to swallow the pain. Akira couldn't imagine how she was doing it. I'll be okay, Sue grunted. Just give me a second. Sue used her good hand to pull her hair to the other side of her head, and Akira saw the 3 pink scars on Sue's forehead again. She'd thought they were only half an inch long, but this close up, Akira realized the scars were only the beginning. Sue's hair hid the worst of it, and Akira pulled away and gasped as she saw what lay underneath. Follow the nose. Under Sue's hair were 3 lines of raised, angry welts that ran like long, thick fingers across her scalp. What happened to your head? Akira whispered. Sue pulled herself up and used her good hand to comb her hair back over her scars. I don't like to talk about it, she said, looking away. Akira held up a hand in apology. But what could have caused an injury like that, with 3 long parallel scars? Akira was dying to know, but she didn't want to press Sue, especially now. Sue lifted her nose and sniffed. I smell food, she said. You can't smell food, Akira told her. The only thing Akira could see, feel, smell, or taste was the bitter gray smoke that hung in the air. Sue breathed in deep and quick, and immediately fell into another coughing fit. But even as she bent over double, she raised her good arm and pointed off into the smoke. "I smell meat," she said around her coughs. "Not meat, but charcoal. Cookout." That could be the forest fire turning trees and houses into charcoal, Akira thought. But the fire was behind them, so who was having a cookout with a wildfire marching toward them? A cookout meant people, at least, and they needed any help they could get. They followed Sue's nose, the fire popping and cracking below them. Minutes later, a dark, shadowy shape loomed ahead in the smoke, and as they got closer, they saw what it was. A 2-story house. One of the many private homes that dotted the mountainside. And it wasn't on fire. Without a word, Akira and Sue picked up their pace. There were no cars in the driveway, and the front door stood open. Akira knocked and called inside. "Hello?" she rasped. "Is anybody here?" Nobody answered. Ordinarily, Akira would never have walked into a stranger's house without an invitation, but this wasn't an ordinary situation. She and Sue exchanged a look and pushed their way inside. Pool party. Smoke drifted in through the open door, and Akira closed it behind them. The light switches didn't work, and the smoky house had a ghostly emptiness to it. "Hello?" Akira called again. No response. She and Sue moved through the house. There was a living room with couches and a TV, bedrooms with half-made beds and clothes on the floor, a game room with a pool table and beanbag chairs and another TV. It was creepy walking around a stranger's house and peeking into their lives while they weren't around. A little exciting, too. "Do you see any phones?" Sue whispered. "No," said Akira. "They must not have a landline." Akira pulled out her phone to check it again, but it still said no service. She fought down her panic and followed Sue down the hall. As they looked into the rest of the rooms, Akira got the strangest feeling that she had been here before. But who did she know who lived in a big, expensive house like this? "Nova!" Akira cried. "What?" Sue asked. "Not a what, a who," said Akira. "A girl my age named Nova lives here. I finally remembered. I came to a birthday pool party at her house when we were in the same 4th grade homeroom." She and Nova were in different classes now, and hung out with different people, but they still waved hello to each other in the hall. "Nova?" Akira called. "Nova, are you here?" "I think everyone's gone," said Sue. "They probably saw the smoke and got out." Akira nodded. "Let's find the kitchen." The kitchen was as big as 2 rooms in Akira's house combined. Akira ran first to the refrigerator, where she found cans of soft drinks for her and Sue. They guzzled the drinks down, quenching their ragged throats. "Oh, hell yes," said Sue, and Akira giggled. When they were finished, Akira raided the cabinet drawers. "What are you looking for?" Sue asked her. Akira held up her find triumphantly. Aspirin. She and her dad always carried aspirin with them when they camped overnight in the mountains, just in case. She shook 2 pills out of the bottle and handed them to Sue. "Take these. Hopefully they'll help with the pain." Akira's dad had also taught her to use ice to reduce any swelling. The power was out, but the freezer was still cold, and the ice in it hadn't melted. Akira found a heavy-duty Ziploc bag with some frozen leftovers in it, dumped the food out in the sink, and filled the bag with ice. "Here, hold this on your shoulder," she told Sue. "I'll see if I can find something to make a sling." Akira ran back to Nova's room and grabbed a sweatshirt, a pillowcase, and a pink backpack. She realized suddenly how weird it was to be going through another girl's room and grabbing things, and she stopped. She was acting like it was the end of the world, and Nova was never coming back. But that wasn't true. Once the fire was out, Nova's family would come home, like the three bears, and find that some Goldilocks had been drinking their sodas and stealing pillowcases from their beds. Akira rooted around in Nova's desk for a pen and paper and quickly scribbled a note to Nova, apologizing for raiding her house and promising to pay her back for everything. "Oh, should I ask how they're doing?" Akira wondered. "P.S. I hope you and your family are okay," she added. Back in the kitchen, Akira opened drawers until she found a roll of duct tape. She made a sling for Sue out of the pillowcase and helped her slowly ease her dislocated arm into it. Next, she took the ice pack, stuffed it into the sweatshirt, and duct taped it all around Sue's arm, shoulder, and neck. When she was finished, Sue looked like a monster with one shoulder way bigger than the other. "Sorry," Akira told her, "but now you don't have to hold the ice to your shoulder the whole time." "Thanks," Sue said. She shifted around as much as she could without hurting herself, but the ice pack didn't come off. "Where'd you learn to do all this?" "My dad taught me," said Akira, and an ember of worry smoldered in her stomach as she wondered again if he was okay. "Does the ice pack sting?" she asked Sue. "No, I like the cold," Sue told her. "I'm kind of a polar bear." Akira filled the backpack with water bottles she found in the pantry and dumped in the apples and bananas that sat in a fruit bowl on the counter. "Can't we stay?" asked Sue. Akira pulled the backpack on and shook her head. "We need to keep moving. Stay ahead of the fire. That's why Nova and her family are gone. We've hung around too long as it is." The house was on an electric well pump like hers, and Akira used the last of the water from the faucet to wet down hand towels they could tie around their faces to keep out the smoke. When she was done, Akira surveyed her handiwork and nodded. Her dad would be proud. Akira suddenly heard the sound of sloshing water and froze. Sue heard it too. They stood and listened, not sure what they were hearing. There was more splashing, and was that the sound of someone laughing? Akira got goosebumps. Was somebody here with them after all? "Did you say you came to a pool party here?" Sue whispered. Akira remembered the burning charcoal smell that had led them to this house. Someone wasn't really swimming and having a cookout in the middle of a wildfire, were they? Akira heard the strange laugh again as she hurried to the back door. No, not a laugh, Akira thought, her heart skipping a beat. It couldn't be. Could it? Akira threw open the back door and stopped dead in her tracks. There wasn't a person splashing around in the pool. It was a horse. Akira's horse. "Dodger!" Akira cried.
Churchill, Manitoba, Part 2. Bad to the bone. Owen landed on his back with an oomph that took his breath away, and he slid to a stop. When his eyes refocused, he saw Mama Bear right above him, rising up to her full height on her back legs. Owen snapped into a fetal position. Chin to his chest, arms folded tight over his head, knees tucked all the way up to his stomach, and tried to disappear. The big polar bear didn't care. She gave a low, mean roar and swatted at him with one of her claws, shredding the sleeve of his parka and raking long, deep gashes in his arm. Owen cried out in agony and rolled over, clutching his bloody, stinging arm to his chest. Through his panic and pain, he saw something green and red rise unsteadily from the ocean of white snow in the distance. "It's George," he realized with a flicker of hope. George was alive! But wait, he was staggering away from Owen and Mama Bear as quickly as he could. George wasn't coming to help him. As much as it broke his heart to be abandoned, Owen understood. He hadn't been paying attention, and he'd come between a mama bear and her cub. Thanks to his obliviousness, he and George had been ruthlessly mauled. If one of them escaped, it deserved to be George. Chomp! Mama Bear bit down hard on Owen's leg, and he howled in pain. A horrible, violent shudder went through him as he felt the unimaginable sensation of the polar bear's teeth grinding on his bone. The pain was almost impossible to endure, and Owen felt himself losing consciousness. He gave up trying to fight it and went limp, playing dead. Why not? He was dead anyway. As his vision blurred, Owen saw the big mama bear rise up on her back legs for one final strike. Pacow! The booming sound startled Owen awake and made Mama Bear flinch. She looked back over her shoulder, and Owen looked with her. It was George! Owen couldn't believe it. George looked like he was about to fall over. His ski mask was torn and his black hair stuck up in tufts, and his head and face and parka were covered in blood. But he was holding the bright silver shotgun they had packed in the snowmobile, the one that was loaded with explosive cracker shells meant to scare off bears. The shotgun Owen was supposed to have been carrying to protect them. Go on, get! George yelled. He cocked the shotgun, and fired it in the air again. Pacow! And this time, Mama Bear moved. Her front paws thumped to the ground and she tore off toward a low hill, where Owen saw her cub hiding among the rocks. She put herself between George and her cub, and pacow! George fired the shotgun in the air again, for good measure. In the blink of an eye, the mama bear and her cub were gone over the hill, blending in again with the snowy terrain. Owen lay back in the snow, panting. His heart was racing, and his breath came in great, deep, painful gasps. He had almost died. George, too. He could see that as George staggered closer. The skin of George's scalp was torn, and there was a glassy look in his eyes. And Owen hadn't noticed it before, but George was holding the shotgun awkwardly. His right hand was on the trigger, but he carried the weight of the forestock on his left arm. His left hand hung uselessly underneath, either strained or broken from his fall. George couldn't have aimed well enough to hit the polar bear, even if he'd been trying. We have to get out of here, George said, his voice thick. She could come back. Owen knew he was right. Some bears did that, even if you scared them off, and he and George would make good meals for Mama Bear and her cub. The bears probably hadn't eaten much in the 5 months they'd been waiting for the sea ice to reform. George helped Owen up as best he could. They leaned on each other as they hobbled back to the snowmobile, both ready for another attack, and neither one sure how they would survive Mama Bear Round 2. Like a boss. Owen punched the emergency stop button on the handle of the snowmobile, and the engine sputtered out. The snowmobile glided to a stop, and he slumped off the seat, taking George with him as they flumped into the snow. Owen didn't know how far they had ridden, or even what direction he'd taken them. He just put as much distance between them and Mama Bear as he could before his exhaustion had overtaken him. Even so, Owen's heart was still beating madly in his chest. They had been attacked by a polar bear. Yes, it had happened to people up here in Churchill before, but it always happened to somebody else, never to you. Owen could barely lift his head, and his right arm and left leg were on fire. But if he was in bad shape, he knew George had to be worse. George had saved them both with the shotgun and the cracker shells, but he'd passed out during their frantic escape on the snowmobile. It had been all Owen could do to steer and keep George from falling off at the same time. Now it was up to Owen to make sure they didn't die out here. Grunting in pain, Owen climbed to his knees and lifted the seat on the snowmobile to access the storage compartment underneath. There was a first aid kit at the bottom, and luckily it was still stocked with bandages and antiseptic wipes and Tylenol. Owen swallowed a couple of the pain relievers himself, hoping they would do something for his pounding headache and help him focus. Owen's wounds were still oozing blood and screaming in pain, but George was unconscious. He had to come first. Owen pulled George up into a sitting position against the snowmobile. George's eyes were closed and his head lolled lifelessly, but Owen could still see the slow, steady rise and fall of his friend's chest. That gave him hope. "Stay with me, George," Owen said. "This is gonna hurt." Very gingerly, Owen pulled his friend's torn ski mask off his head. It was crusted with blood and hair and was sticky as it came away. Owen took one look at what was underneath and shuddered. George's head looked terrible. How was he even alive? Owen poured a little water on the wound from one of the bottles they brought with them, and as the blood washed away, he was relieved to see that the gash looked worse than it really was. Even so, his best friend had taken a really good whack from that bear, enough for him to still be unconscious. Maybe he has a concussion, Owen thought. There was no way to know, not until he could get George to the health center. Owen cleaned the rest of the wound as well as he could with water and antiseptic wipes. After he'd wrapped his friend's head in bandages, he tried to wake him up. "Yo, Cheese, wake up, man," he said, gently shaking George's shoulder. "Not," George muttered, his eyes fluttering. "Not what? Come on, dude, you have to wake up," Owen told him. "I'm not," George said, his words mushy like wet snow. "I am not the cheese." Owen laughed with relief. If George was making jokes, he was all right. Or would be. He got his friend to drink some water and take some Tylenol, and slowly, George began to come back to his senses. "Dude," Owen told his friend, "you look like a boss back there, face and hands all bloody and scaring off that polar bear with a shotgun?" The shotgun I was supposed to be carrying, Owen thought. The guilt still weighed on him like a heavy coat, but if George was thinking the same thing, he didn't say it. "I was a boss," said George, his tongue still thick. "You have to tell all the girls back at school." Owen laughed again. "I will, dude. I will." Owen shifted in the snow and hissed in pain. That seemed to wake George up more than anything, and he lifted his head off the snowmobile. "That polar bear tagged you pretty good too," he said. "Let's see." George pulled back Owen's torn pant leg and sleeve, and then it was George's turn to gasp. Swiss cheese. Owen hadn't had a problem looking at the gash on George's forehead, but he couldn't bring himself to look at his own injuries. He sucked in a breath against the pain. "Is it bad?" "Let's just say that you are now officially the cheese," George told him. "As in the Swiss cheese." Owen spent the longest minutes of his life clenching his stomach against the pain as George cleaned and bandaged his wounds. When George tipped his leg up, blood ran out of Owen's boot like cranberry juice from a cup. "We need to get you to the health center," George told him. "You too," Owen said. The health center was where you went for everything from a little cough to getting mauled by a bear. But it was all the way back in Churchill. They had a snowmobile, but neither of them was in much condition to drive. "Maybe we can call the Mounties. Get them to fly us out of here in a helicopter," George said. The Mounties were the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Still blinking dully, George shifted himself around to look for his phone in the seat compartment. "Where are we?" he asked. "I don't know," said Owen. He'd stopped on a wide, flat spot with no rocks sticking up out of it, but other than that, he had no idea. Well, did you go north, east, south? What? Dude, there was a polar bear, Owen protested. You were unconscious. My leg was falling off. I just got us on the snowmobile and drove. I didn't care where. Well, how is anybody supposed to find us when... Crack! The ground suddenly dropped a few centimeters underneath them. George and Owen froze. Crick! Crack! The ground tilted, and the snowmobile slid slowly away from them, finally stopping with a little wobble. Did you drive us out onto a frozen lake? George whispered. In the heart of winter, every lake in the region would be frozen solid. But now, in October, the ice could still be thin in places. I don't know, Owen hissed. I just drove until I couldn't sit up straight anymore. Crack! The ground beneath them jerked lower again, and this time there was no doubt. They had both been out on the tundra enough to know when they were on thin ice. There was no telling how deep the water was underneath them. Because the frozen permafrost was just a half-meter beneath the active layer of soil, all the water on the tundra stayed near the surface. That meant that a lot of the lakes in the region were shallow enough to stand in. But no matter how deep it was, there was no way they were getting the heavy snowmobile out again if it fell in, and neither of them would survive very long out here if they took a dip in freezing water. George and Owen looked at each other and knew what the other was thinking without having to say it. They had to get themselves and their snowmobile off this ice as quickly and as carefully as they could. On thin ice. They didn't start the snowmobile up for fear that just yanking on the starter cord would break the ice underneath their feet. Instead, Owen and George set the first aid kit back inside the seat and, grunting and straining from their injuries, pushed the snowmobile as gently as they could toward what they hoped was the edge of the lake. I can't believe you drove the snowmobile out onto a lake, George said. It's covered in snow, Owen whispered. And you're welcome, by the way, for getting you out of there when you were unconscious. And you're welcome for saving you from the polar bear. They were both tense and anxious. Owen knew that was why they were testy with each other. Slowly, the snowmobile crept along. Neither of them was in any shape to be pushing anything, but they had no other choice. I've never been so scared of anything in my whole entire life as when that mama bear attacked us, said Owen. I was sure we were gonna die. I would have if you hadn't fired those cracker shells. And I'd be a goner if you hadn't yelled at her and made her come at you, George said. And you got me out of there when I was gonna pass out. You didn't leave me behind. Of course not, Owen said. They looked into each other's eyes and nodded. They always had each other's backs. Owen held up a fist, and George bumped it. Owen kept searching the horizon as they pushed the snowmobile, looking for polar bears. He wasn't going to make the same mistake as before and be caught off guard. So I realize this isn't the best advertisement for Churchill right now, Owen said. I don't know, said George. You could put this on a postcard. Getting wrecked by a polar bear in Churchill, Manitoba. Wish you were here. Bet we'd sell a ton of them. Seriously, though, I don't want you to add this to the list, Owen told him. What list? Asked George. All the reasons you don't want to live here anymore, Owen said. It's like you're looking for things to add to the list. George stared at the ground and didn't say anything. Was he mad? Frustrated? About to pass out from pain again? Owen couldn't tell. I just don't want you to leave, man. You're my best friend in the whole world, Owen told George. We're a team. We're mac and cheese. George shook his head. I told you I am not the... Crack! The ice buckled underneath the snowmobile, and Owen and George froze as a thin layer of water pooled at their feet. They were sinking into the lake. The ice never forgets. They were on another thin patch, so thin that lake water was already seeping through. "We have to back up. Go a different direction," George whispered. Owen and George pulled the snowmobile away from the cracking ice and made a difficult Y-turn in the snow. After they'd turned around, George had to take a minute before they started pushing again. Owen wasn't in much better shape. His arm and leg throbbed with pain, and his boot was leaving a red trail in the snow. "You good?" Owen asked. George nodded. "Of course. You?" "Couldn't be better," said Owen. They were both lying, and they knew it, but they got moving. Together, they pushed the snowmobile toward a rise that had to be the bank of the lake. Owen huffed and panted and sweated inside his clothes. Pushing the snowmobile wasn't easy when they weren't injured. Now it was grueling. Both of them needed to be lying in cozy hospital beds right now, not straining themselves out here in the wind and snow. Owen scanned the horizon again. No polar bears. When he looked back, he saw George starting to fade again. "George, stay with me," Owen said. "Talk to me. Tell me something your dad taught you about the ice." George's dad loved learning the old ways people used to survive up here before there were trains and planes and snowmobiles. Ways that had adapted and changed over time and were often still useful and meaningful today. George blinked and tried to focus. "My dad says that if it's -20 outside, people nowadays figure it's safe to go out on the ice, even if last weekend it was sunny and 15 degrees above zero. But that ice, it's not going to be as thick as they think it'll be. You might have forgotten it was warm last weekend, but the ice never forgets." "You bet your ice it doesn't," said Owen. George started to laugh, and he closed his eyes and hugged his stomach. "Don't," said George. "Come on, get your ice in gear, Cheese," Owen said. "Stop," George said, laughing harder. "It hurts." Owen was snickering now too, and they took a much-needed moment to laugh it out. Owen lifted his goggles to wipe the tears from his eyes. When he got his goggles resettled on his face and looked up, he froze. George, stop," he whispered. "There's another polar bear." Big Boy. A huge polar bear stood on its hind legs on the other side of the lake, sniffing the air. Owen glanced at the trail of blood behind him and winced. Polar bears could smell a seal from miles away, he remembered. And bleeding 8th graders too, I guess. George crept around to Owen's side of the snowmobile, keeping his eyes on the bear the whole time. It wasn't Mama Bear this time. It was a full-grown adult male. He would have been fasting for months while waiting for the sea ice to reform, but he was still twice as big as the bear that had wrecked them before. "Is he the same one from the tundra buggy this morning?" George asked. "No," said Owen. This bear had been through the wars, as Owen's dad liked to say. He had a long scar down one side of his face that just missed his eye, and one of his ears looked like something had taken a bite out of it. Otherwise, he was a big, strong adult bear, as majestic as he was scary. Owen didn't understand. What were so many polar bears doing this far inland? It was the end of the polar bear season. The sea ice had reformed. The bears should be out on the ice hunting seals, not here hunting human beings. "We do it right this time," George said quietly, and Owen nodded. They couldn't afford not to. George leaned forward and patted around inside the seat compartment until he found the silver shotgun. Owen went next, feeling for the box of cracker shells. Neither of them took their eyes off the polar bear for a second. Owen found the orange box of shells and held it open as George reloaded the shotgun. The shotgun held 6 shells at a time, and George fed in 3 new shells to replace the ones he'd fired to scare off the mama bear and her cub, bringing them back up to 6. The big bear thumped back down on all fours and began to circle them. Owen had seen polar bears do the same thing to the tundra buggy. It was how the bears investigated something new, spiraling in toward it to assess the threat. "Just back away slowly," George said, gripping the shotgun. Owen put down the rest of the cracker shells and backed up with him. As the polar bear circled in closer to the snowmobile, Owen and George spiraled farther away, always keeping the bear in sight as they backed up. "He's a big boy, isn't he?" George said quietly. "Maybe he'll fall through the ice." "Probably not," Owen said. "A polar bear's wide paws distribute its weight as it walks." George looked sideways at Owen. "Dude, where was all this polar bear knowledge before we got surprised by two of them?" Owen stumbled as they backed into a low ridge and fell on his butt. They were on solid ground. That was something. But they still needed their snowmobile, and right now, the big bear had his nose buried in the seat compartment, snuffling around for food. The polar bear found some crackers Owen and George had brought with them and ate them up, box and all. Next, he devoured a package of jerky and chased it down with an entire plastic jar of peanut butter. "Interesting choice," said Owen. "I would have paired the peanut butter with the crackers, but okay." The polar bear stuck his nose back inside the seat compartment, and George grabbed Owen's arm in horror when he saw what he pulled out next. The polar bear had found the brownies. A polar bear ate my snowmobile. "No, not the brownies," George moaned as the big polar bear scarfed them down. "Your mom's brownies are life." "You know, if you move away from Churchill, you won't be able to eat them anymore," Owen said. George looked sideways at Owen, his eyebrows even higher than usual. "Are you really worried about me leaving Churchill right now when there's a polar bear using our snowmobile as his own personal picnic basket?" Owen shrugged. The polar bear swished his big paw around inside the storage compartment, looking for something else to eat. Owen winced as shotgun shells and a hatchet and his mobile phone tumbled out onto the snow. "Maybe he'll leave us alone now that he's eaten all our food," George said. With polar bears, it's not survival of the fittest, but survival of the fattest," Owen told him. "They can eat 100-kilo seal in one sitting." George sighed. "Your polar bear facts are really starting to depress me." Owen was sure the polar bear would come for them next, but instead he opened his mouth and took a big bite out of the seat cushion. Owen blinked. He's eating our snowmobile." George and Owen watched in stunned silence as the big polar bear ripped away another piece of foam padding and chewed on it. "You know, it's weird, but polar bears love to eat plastic and stuff," George said matter-of-factly. "My dad told me he saw a polar bear eat the cushions off a sofa once." "Dude, I don't care about somebody's sofa right now," Owen whispered. "He's eating our only mode of transportation." When the seat cushion was totally gone, the polar bear moved on to the handlebars, gnawing on them like a dog working a bone. Owen nudged George. "Shoot a cracker shell," he told him. "No, the sound might crack the ice and the snowmobile will fall in." "It's not going to matter if he tears up the snowmobile so bad we can't drive it," Owen told him. George huffed, but he must have decided Owen was right. He took a step forward and raised the shotgun high into the air. "Let's go, bear! Get!" George called. Pacow! The cracker shell was designed to be louder than an actual shotgun shell, and Owen flinched at the sound. So did the bear. He lost his balance on the snowmobile and knocked it over, driving the other end of the handlebars into the ice like a harpoon. Crick! Crack! Splash! The snowmobile and the polar bear suddenly dropped through the surface of the ice together, and freezing water sloshed up out of the huge hole. Owen and George gasped. Everything they had except for the shotgun and the parkas on their backs had just sunk to the bottom of the lake. A few seconds later, the polar bear's head popped up out of the water and he snorted. Polar bears are great swimmers, Owen remembered. George grabbed Owen by the arm and pulled him away. "Dude, we have to get out of here while he's in the water," George whispered. "Run, Icehole, run!"
Miami, Florida, Part 2. Swept away. No, Natalie thought in a panic, watching her house disappear in the rain. Mamá, tía Beatriz.
Natalie tumbled and turned in the water, cursing the squirming dog in her hand. "Stop fighting, Diablito," she thought. Natalie's feet weren't even touching the ground. Water sloshed in her gasping mouth, and she choked as she kicked and thrashed. She had to find someplace up and out of the water, somewhere covered and out of the rain and wind. Natalie swam for the houses on the far side of the street, but Reuben pushed her back. She tried to kick up higher, but Reuben pulled her lower. She tried to grab onto a half-buried stop sign, but Reuben spun her away. Natalie screamed into the wind. She couldn't remember feeling so helpless, so exhausted. No matter what she tried to do, Reuben made her do something else. And all while blaring that train whistle roar. Bwah! Bwah! Like he was reminding her who was boss. A refrigerator floated by, and Natalie grabbed at it, hoping to cling to it like a log, but it spun in the water and sank at her touch. She didn't see the stove that followed the refrigerator until it slammed right into her. Bright pain shot up and down her side, and she cried out, swallowing more gray seawater. The swirling storm surge pulled her under with the stove, and Natalie had to let go of Churro so she wouldn't take him with her. She kicked and fought, turning upside down and round in the water until she didn't know which way was up. "I'm going to die," was all Natalie could think. "I'm going to die." Her head shot out of the water, and Natalie gasped and coughed, dizzy and disoriented. Reuben's attacks on her felt personal now, like this was some kind of game the hurricane was playing with her. First, he had knocked down the wall of her house. Then he had swept her out into the street. Now he was batting her around like Churro playing with a squeaker toy. Churro! Natalie was sure she had lost him. She treaded water, turning and squinting through the rain, and was surprised when she spotted him. But what she saw didn't make any sense. Churro was standing on top of the water as he floated down the street. Hitchhikers. Natalie swam toward Churro. How was he standing on top of the water but still moving? As she got closer, Natalie's hands struck something hard under the water's surface. She ran her fingers along it, feeling its contours, and she understood. The storm surge was carrying a car down the street, and Churro had hitched a ride on top of it. Churro crouched low, his legs splayed out for balance. The wind pushed him back and forth on the top of the car, and he shivered in terror. "Hang on, Churro!" Natalie cried. She pulled herself along the car's roof rack, keeping her body in the water. Reuben tried to yank her away, lashing her face and hands with stinging rain. But Natalie hung on, working her way around the car until she could curl her legs up on the trunk. With something finally underneath her, Natalie pulled Churro into a protective hug. "I'm here, Churro," Natalie said. Churro couldn't have heard her above the wind, but for once he didn't bark at her or growl, nestling into the shelter of her arm instead. Boom! Something electrical exploded in a shower of sparks a block away and made them both jump. Natalie watched as the wind stripped the gutter off a house, as easy as peeling the skin off a banana. Trees snapped and went flying away into the darkness. Street signs folded flat around their poles. And the water was almost up to the eaves of the one-story houses that lined the street. Natalie's thoughts flew back to her mother and Tia Beatriz, trapped in the house. What if they didn't find a way out before the water reached the ceiling? Something thumped inside the car beneath her, and Natalie looked down at the back window. A white, lifeless human face stared back up at her, and Natalie screamed. There was a drowned woman inside the car. Natalie turned away and retched into the water. She tried not to look, tried not to think about the body, but she could still feel the dead woman's eyes on her. She glanced down again. She had to. She couldn't help it. And saw the dead woman's body was mashed into the space where the window and the ceiling met. Her head twisted sideways at an unnatural angle, like something out of a zombie movie. Natalie shuddered uncontrollably. She had to get off this car. And not just because of the dead woman inside. All around her, Natalie recognized the familiar palm trees and traffic light poles of the 6-lane Okeechobee Road. Oh no. No, 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 Natalie thought. The highway wasn't the problem. It was what was just across Okeechobee Road that scared Natalie. Reuben was pushing her toward the canal. 15 feet deep and miles long, Miami's canals funneled fresh water from the Everglades and rainwater from regular storms through the city and out to the sea. But Miami's canals were places you definitely did not want to go swimming. Every year, the city pulled lots of cars and trash from the canals. Dead bodies, too. But there was something even scarier in the canals. If Natalie and Churro didn't get off this car, and fast, they were going to go swimming with the alligators. The Drowning House. Thunder boomed, and the lightning illuminated a row of houses along the side of the road. As the darkness returned, Natalie caught the flicker of light in one of the second-story windows. Candles, which meant someone was in there. Someone she could take shelter with. "Hang on, Churro!" Natalie cried. She pushed off into the swirling water, trying not to think about the pale, lifeless face watching her from the back window of the car. Who was the woman? How had she been caught in her car when the floodwaters came? Had she been on the way home, or trying to make one last desperate attempt to flee the city? Whatever the reason, that car and the canal on the other side of Okeechobee Road would be the woman's last resting place until someone could fish her out. Natalie just had to make sure she and Churro didn't join her. Natalie held the little dog up out of the water as much as she could. He wasn't thrilled to go back into the storm surge, and he was growling again. Growling and shivering with fear at the same time. Chihuahuas, thought Natalie. Natalie struggled toward the house, kicking and flailing. The rain and wind blasted her. The water rose and fell. But this time, Reuben worked with her, not against her. The storm surge was already higher than the front door. But as the water ebbed, Natalie was able to grab on to the top of the doorframe, take a deep breath, and swim in through the open door. When Natalie came up out of the water inside, her head was only a foot away from the ceiling. She panicked in the tight space, thinking again about Mama and Tia Beatriz drowning as the water rose in their one-story house. But this house had a way up, a way out, if she could only find the stairs. Natalie spun around in the darkness, still treading water. The room she found herself in was a washing machine full of all the things that had filled the house. Magazines, clocks, clothes, pots and pans, sofa cushions, video game controllers, hairbrushes, books. They all swirled around in the dark, foamy water that pushed and pulled through the open front door and the broken windows. And the water was still rising. "We've got to get out of here before we're trapped," Natalie told Churro, and he barked in response. It was dark and close, but Natalie thought she saw stairs on the other side of the room. She turned to float on her back, put Churro on her chest, and used her hands to pull herself across the ceiling. The water in the room rose and fell, but always rising more than falling. A floating basketball bumped into her. Something prickly and spiderweb-like brushed her leg. Natalie's breath came in quick, frantic gasps, and she hurried her pace. Suddenly, Churro jumped off her chest and into the water. "No, Churro, wait!" Natalie cried out, turning to try and see where he was. There, Churro was splashing toward a rectangular opening in the ceiling. The stairs. Natalie spun around so she wasn't on her back anymore and swam like a frog behind Churro. "Go, Churro! Go!" Natalie yelled. Churro made it to the top step, half in, half out of the water, and turned to bark encouragement at Natalie. A few seconds later, she found the stairs herself, and she crawled up after the little dog and collapsed onto the carpet of the second floor. "Good heavens!" said a woman's voice. "Marcus, Javari, pick her up. Get her away from there." Gentle hands lifted Natalie, and she let herself be carried down a narrow hallway. Two teenage black boys propped her up against the wall in between electronics equipment they must have saved from downstairs. Their eyes were full of amazement and concern for the girl who had washed up on their stairs. The man and woman Natalie took to be their parents crowded in close behind them. "You all right?" the father said. "How'd you even get down there?" Natalie broke into exhausted tears. "Mamá, tía Beatriz, tengo que volver con ellas," she sobbed. "I'm sorry, honey. We don't speak Spanish," the mother said. Natalie blinked. She hadn't even realized she was speaking Spanish. It was her first language, and Natalie sometimes found herself falling back on it when she was frightened or confused. Natalie switched to English, and her whole story came gushing out. The wall collapsing, the water rising, escaping through the window with Churro, being swept away down the street. "I have to go back for them," Natalie said. "Mamá and tía Beatriz, they're drowning in our house." "Calm down. You're safe now, honey," the mother said. "But I'm sorry. You're going nowhere till this storm is over. None of us are." Natalie swallowed a sob, but she knew the woman was right. She'd barely survived being out in water the first time. There was no way she was getting back to her mother and tía Beatriz any time soon. A Little Space. The woman's name was Anne Evans. Her husband was Derek, and their two sons were Marcus and Javari. Anne was taller than Natalie's mother, with curly hair and a friendly smile. Her husband, Derek, was a head taller than his wife. He was very fit and had a black beard the same length as the short hair on his head. Marcus and Javari were both long-limbed and good-looking. Javari wore his hair in a buzz cut, and Marcus, the older brother, had a temp fade. The family all had the same dark brown skin and the same kind, worried look in their eyes. Javari, in particular, was really cute. Under different circumstances, Natalie might have blushed and looked away, but there was no time for that now. "I'm Natalie, and that's Churro," Natalie said, her teeth chattering. Churro shook water off himself, then bared his teeth and growled at the Evans family. Friendly as always. "Javari, give the girl your hoodie. She's freezing," his father told him. Natalie didn't realize how much she was shivering. The water hadn't been cold exactly, but it wasn't body temperature either, and she'd been in it for a long time. She gratefully accepted the hoodie and slipped it on, and Anne brought her a bottle of water. "Give us a little space," Anne said, and shooed the men into one of the bedrooms off the hall. She didn't know how Anne knew, but as soon as the others were gone, Natalie's tears came, and she couldn't turn them off. Tears of grief for her mother and Thea. Tears for the dead woman in the car. Tears for herself, battered and bruised and so maddeningly helpless. Natalie pulled Javari's hoodie over her head and drew her knees up to her chin, embarrassed to be crying in front of a stranger. But it didn't bother Anne. She sat down beside Natalie and put an arm around her, letting Natalie cry into her shoulder. "Get it out, hun," Anne told her. "It's a lot." Churro barked at something. And Natalie dragged the sleeve of the hoodie across her nose and tried to see what he was on about now. It was the water. Another wave crashed in the room below, and water sprayed up through the stairwell, sloshing on the upstairs carpet. The water was still rising. Churro barked and backed away, and Natalie watched in horror as the storm surge rose past the second floor and began to flood the hallway. Anne stood quickly. "Boys," she called over the howling winds. "Get these things up on a bed! Quick!" Marcus and Javari and their dad hurried back into the hall and were stunned to see the floodwater lapping at the top of the stairs. They hurriedly snatched up electronics and took them into one of the bedrooms, and Natalie got up to help. By the time they were finished, the water was up to Churro's knees. Natalie picked Churro up and backed away, shaking her head. "It just keeps coming," she muttered. "It's too big. It's too much." Anne took hold of her shoulders and looked her in the eyes. "It's all right, Natalie. We're going to be okay." But we're not going to be okay, Natalie thought. There were already 3 inches of water on the floor, on the 2nd story. The Evans men came sloshing back into the hall and stared incredulously at the rising water. "I don't believe it," Derek said. "The water's never come this high before." Suddenly, the floor shifted underneath them, and they all threw their hands out to brace themselves against the wall. Natalie and Javari shared a wide-eyed, disbelieving look. They were dreaming. They had to be. The floor underneath them shuddered and lurched again, sloshing water back and forth across their feet, and this time there was no doubting it. The house was moving. Rising water. Natalie hugged Churro tight and backed up against a wall. The storm surge was tearing the Evanses' house away, and them with it. "We gotta get out of here!" Derek shouted over the roar of the storm. "Where?" Anne yelled back. "The downstairs is totally flooded," said Javari. So much water was coming up from below that it wasn't even splashing anymore. It was just rising, 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 like a bathtub filling with water. The dark, murky storm surge was up to Natalie's calves. No, thought Natalie. This can't be happening. Not again. "Out a window?" Marcus yelled. "No," Natalie said, snapping out of her trance. She remembered her battle with Reuben and knew she wouldn't survive a second round. She was too exhausted, and the storm just seemed to be getting stronger. "We can't get in the water," she told them. "Can we get up on the roof?" It wasn't the greatest idea, Natalie knew. On the roof, they'd be exposed to the full fury of Reuben. But the house lurched again, and the floor tilted sideways, and they all knew they had to do something, and fast. "There's a skylight in our bedroom," Derek hollered. "Javari, get your baseball bat." Derek and Anne led the rest of them to their bedroom, sloshing through almost a foot of water. Natalie suddenly thought how strange it was that she was walking around making plans with people she'd just met. But they were all in this together now. Nobody was a stranger in a storm. Derek and his eldest son pushed the bed under a small plastic skylight in the ceiling, and Javari came back with a metal bat. Natalie held Churro in her arms and watched as Derek hopped up on the bed and jabbed at the skylight with the bat until it broke. Whoosh! Rain and wind blasted in through the hole, and Natalie turned away from the spray. Derek knocked away the rest of the plastic, and then his dad joined him up on the bed. "You go first and help the others from your end," Derek told his son. Marcus nodded, and Natalie watched as Derek helped him up and out of the hole. Derek took Anne's hand for her to go next. "Our money!" she yelled, trying to pull away. "Our IDs! All our birth certificates and things!" "We have to leave it," Derek told his wife. Natalie flashed back to putting all her family's valuables and personal mementos up high to keep them out of the water. Their family photos, her great-grandparents' love letters, her weather journals, the box of friendship bracelets Shannon had made her. And Mariposa, Natalie realized with a gasp. They were all gone now. Derek lifted Anne up to Marcus on the roof and motioned for Natalie to go next. She handed Churro up first, and he growled and barked at her and Marcus and the storm. "I know, Churro, I know," Natalie said. "I don't want to go back out there either, but we have to." Seconds later, it was Natalie's turn. Derek lifted her up and Marcus pulled her through. And suddenly Natalie was in the storm again. Rain stung her, and the wind tried to sweep her off the roof, but Anne was there to grab her hand. She pulled Natalie in close, and they hid as best they could in the lee of a solar water heater. Natalie took Churro from Anne and zipped him up in her hoodie, wrapping her arms around him to keep him safe. Churro poked his head out and barked at the hurricane, but Natalie couldn't hear anything except the roar of the storm, couldn't feel or taste or see anything but the lash of rain and the brutal wind. Reuben was a total assault on her senses. Javari and Derek joined them at last, but there was barely enough room for all of them behind the solar panel. Derek yelled something, but his words were lost in the storm. Beneath them, the roof shuddered and tilted. The storm surge was ripping the house off its foundation. Natalie and the Evans family all looked at each other with terror in their eyes. They weren't safe here. But where could they go? Natalie squinted through the storm. It was pitch black outside, but the lightning strikes were so fast and so frequent, they looked like strobe lights. On, off, on, off, on, off. Natalie could see other rooftops in the brief moments of full light, but they were all too far away, separated from her and the Evans family by wide, raging rivers of floodwater. Natalie felt Churro shift in her hoodie, and she looked down at him. He was still barking furiously. One tiny dog against the biggest, baddest hurricane Miami had ever seen. But his focus had shifted. He was yapping at something new, something Natalie could now see floating toward them on the 2-story-high storm surge. Something that might be the answer to all their prayers. All aboard. It was a boat. The strobing light from the storm made it look like it was in a stop-motion video. But a small sailboat was definitely coming down the street-turned river toward the Evanses' house. Natalie couldn't believe it. Miami was a boat town, but all the marinas were way out on the ocean. But if the oceans come to us, why not a sailboat too? Natalie thought wildly. The mast was torn away and dragged behind it in a tangle of ropes. But the boat looked like it had a small cabin. If they could get inside it. Natalie poked Anne and pointed to the boat, and she saw the woman's eyes light up. Anne nudged the rest of her family, and Derek grabbed hold of the solar heater's struts and signaled for them all to hold hands. Derek anchored them at one end, while Anne, Natalie, and Javari stretched as far as they could in the middle for Marcus to be able to reach the water. The boat drifted closer, closer, until at last it bumped into the house. Marcus lunged for the railing, but missed. "Grab it! Grab it!" Natalie screamed, Reuben swallowing her words. The wind and waves knocked the little boat around, began to push it away from the roof. Marcus tried again, but the railing was just out of his reach. He wasn't going to be able to catch it. Natalie panicked, watching their one chance at escape drifting away. She stretched her arms out as far as they could go, just barely holding on to Javari's and Anne's fingertips. And Marcus had it. He had the rail of the boat in his hand. One by one, Natalie and the Evanses slipped and slid down the roof and climbed on board. And within moments, the wind had already pushed them and the sailboat yards away from the tilting house. Derek pointed to the cabin door. Natalie was closest, and she held Churro tight as she climbed down the steps. The door was unlocked, and Natalie crawled inside and sagged with relief at the bottom of the stairs, thankful to be out of the storm again. Churro poked his head out of her hoodie and barked, and Natalie looked up in surprise. There were other people on the boat. Refugees. A middle-aged Latina woman and her two small children, a boy and a girl, were huddled on a U-shaped bench at the far end of the cabin. They looked as wet and exhausted and frightened as Natalie, and just as surprised to see her as she was to see them. "Hola," said Natalie. "Hello?" the woman said. Natalie was about to say something more when the Evans family climbed down into the cabin behind her. Natalie moved toward the new family, and they made room for her on the bench. There was a small bed behind the stairs and a narrow space down the middle of the cabin with a stovetop and sink. Counting Natalie and the 4 Evanses, plus the mom and her 2 little kids, the 8 of them filled the tiny space. Derek was the last one in, and he turned to his family with a dazed look. "Our house," he said. "I just saw it tear away and slip under the water. It's gone." The Evans family sat in stunned silence. "I was just in that house, and now it's gone," Natalie thought. Had the other 3 walls of her own house been carried away? Or her roof again? Was anywhere safe from this hurricane? "Sorry," Natalie said at last to the woman with the 2 little kids. "We saw your boat come by and we jumped on it." "It's not ours either," the woman said. "We hitched a ride when our house flooded, like you." She looked down, as though seeing something else in her mind's eye. "I came over from Cuba on a raft in the 90s. She said, hugging her children tight. "I'm an American citizen now. I never thought I'd be a refugee on a boat again." Natalie nodded. There were a lot of Cuban Americans in Hialeah, and she went to school with more than a few kids whose parents had fled Cuba themselves when they were children. Natalie never thought she'd be a refugee either. The sailboat struck something in the water. A car? A street sign? What was left of the Evans house? And there was an awful screeching sound. The little boat shuddered and swayed, and then they were past whatever it was and only the hurricane battered them. The little boy reached out a hand to pet Churro, but the dog growled and snapped at him. "Sorry," said Natalie. "Churro's not too friendly." "He's scared, Ivan. Just like us," the boy's mother told him. "Ivan," Anne said. "Is he named after the Hurricane Ivan?" "No," the woman said with a small smile. "For my best friend when I was a girl. This is my daughter, Valentina, and my name is Isabel." Natalie and the Evans family slowly came back to life and introduced themselves. The storm raged outside, and the little sailboat rocked and bumped into things as Reuben played with it. but they were safe. For now. Hurricane Ivan. That was the year Marcus was born, Derek said. First big one I remember was Andrew, 1992. I was in Cuba for that one, said Isabel. My abuela died in that storm. She was quiet for a moment, then looked back up. But I was here in El Norte for the others. Opal, Charlie, Ivan, Jean, then Dennis, Derek remembered. Katrina hit us on the way by, said Marcus. And Wilma, said Javari. Irma, Natalie said, adding her own most memorable storm. Then Michael. It was a list almost every South Floridian knew by heart and could recite like a mantra. The names of the worst hurricanes. The ones that had killed the most people, done the most damage. All within their lifetimes. And it was getting worse, thought Natalie. Not only was climate change making hurricanes come earlier and stay later and get more intense, as she'd told Tia Beatriz that morning, but there were more hurricanes than ever before. Last year, there had been 30 named storms, the most ever. And for 2 years in a row, they had run out of names and had to start using Greek letters instead. Natalie thought about saying all that, but this didn't seem like the right time. Everybody was quiet, and after a while, Natalie noticed the rocking of the boat seemed to steady out. Maybe the storm's letting up, Natalie said. But that didn't make any sense. They could still hear Reuben rampaging outside, as loud and angry as before. No, it's not the storm. Look! Isabel gasped, pointing at the floor. There had been water in the boat before, but now it was up over Natalie's shoes. Her feet were already so wet she hadn't noticed. It's the boat! Isabel cried. The boat is sinking!